hell's your problem?
Cyberpunk 2077. If only I could find the words to describe the roller coaster this game has been through since launch. At the time of writing, Cyberpunk 2077 has been delisted from the PlayStation Store just minutes ago. But you're not here to hear about that. You want to hear about the game, and I will give it my best shot. But I want to clear up a few things first. I played Cyberpunk 2077 on a relatively high-end PC with an RTX 2060 Super and a Ryzen 5 3600. My experience is not reflective of the content of the game on console. To that effect, this review only applies to the PC version of Cyberpunk 2077. All footage used in this review is either from official trailers or is my own, captured on my rig. 3 of our writers will be doing a written joint review of the console version over at Gameluster.com, so be sure to keep an eye out for that. I also won't be factoring in any of our many qualms or problems with CD Projekt Red as a company, or their handling of the game before, during, or after launch. Check out Gameluster.com for our thoughts and opinions on those events in separate pieces. With all that in mind, let's get to it.
Okay, hit me. Just promise me it won't hurt.
It won't. Not this time.
Walking into Cyberpunk 2077, I was anticipating something a little bit similar to The Witcher 3 with a new setting, story, and characters. Right off the bat, I can tell you that Cyberpunk 2077 does not feel like The Witcher 3, even a little bit. The structure is much more akin to something like Fallout, while the game world is reminiscent of Grand Theft Auto V with a cyberpunk flair. Let's start on the story. I've actually rather enjoyed the main story so far. The prologue chapter took about 7 hours to complete, so when the title screen splashed up, I thought I was going to be in for a long ride. The main quest is actually just over 20 hours of content, assuming you don't do any side quests. Personally, I think that's the perfect length. I've grown quite tired of 50-hour open-world games, and I'm glad I have the chance to revel in a tightly crafted narrative for once. The player character, named V, sets out into Night City with her partner Jackie Wells to claim all the money, fame, and glory that the gritty, blood-soaked streets of the City of Dreams has to offer. The two of you stumble into the score of a lifetime, and finally, it's that big job that puts you on the map, and the pair eventually finds that they've stumbled into the middle of something much bigger than they thought possible. The main story isn't without its problems, though. As intriguing as the main quest is, a lot of it is predicated on the tired tropes about Japanese people that a bunch of old white men cooked up in the 80s during the birth of the cyberpunk genre. You won't find a single Japanese person without an almost comically thick accent, and every conversation with Japanese characters tied to the main story is somehow about honor and ancestry. Cyberpunk as a genre is inherently racist against East Asians, yes, but when you are making the biggest piece of cyberpunk fiction of the decade, you have to be better. You have a responsibility to redefine what cyberpunk is. Putting that aside, I would say that Cyberpunk 2077 mostly excels when it is tightly controlling the narrative. It's only when you get out into the open world that you would begin to spot any of its faults. I'm sure you want to hear about Keanu Reeves. He turns in a fairly good performance as Johnny Silverhand and has probably more screen time than any other character in the game. Without spoiling anything, Keanu is essentially your companion throughout the entire main story. If you're a fan of his other work, you will absolutely love him in this. It is very much more of the same, and he brings the exact same energy to Cyberpunk that he does to John Wick. My first major commendation for Cyberpunk 2077 is to the writers, for their excellent ability to make me care about the characters. The dialogue is consistently great, even through most of the side quests, and Jackie, Mama Wells, Misty, Panam, and Victor, just to name a few, began to feel like real people. When a certain character died during the main story, I was actually so upset I had to put the game down for about an hour. And that's the kind of storytelling I want from a game. One of the few strengths CDPR has managed to carry over from The Witcher 3 is the quality of the writing. The pacing is perfect, and you'll find yourself itching to get back to that story while wandering around Night City. I do want to note that in dialogue, you'll get a short prompt on the screen, and then V will say something slightly different upon pressing it. The dialogue trees are not intricate, and nowhere near something like Fallout New Vegas, but definitely more layered than The Witcher 3. You're typically given just 1 or 2 prompts that you can use to progress the conversation. 90% of the time it's just the one, and the other prompts are there to expound on something or get a little more info. If you weren't a fan of the dialogue system in Fallout 4, you are not going to enjoy this one. It is pretty much the exact same. So let's talk about our protagonist, V. The character creator is mostly robust with a few key oddities. One is that V's gender and pronouns are tied to the voice you select, male or female. You can indeed make a transgender character by creating a male body with a female voice, or vice versa, but it certainly falls short of the robust gender options CDPR was touting a few months ago. In addition, although it was promised, V cannot be non-binary. This is another small disappointment, stumbling onto a key element that was promised and unfulfilled. You'll also need to manually select your genitals during character creation, which has led to some people having existential crises during gameplay after discovering they have none. One other issue is that you can't alter anything about your appearance, not even your haircut or color, after you start the game. Make sure to lock in what you want to look like. There is no turning back. As a character, V is sort of your typical cyberpunk anti-hero who lusts for fame and fortune, but underneath has a heart of gold. Both the male and female voice actors for V do very fine work, although personally I think the female VA delivers a little more nuance. I also want to say something very positive here. Cyberpunk 2077 has probably the most realistic facial animations I've ever seen in a video game. Every time I'm in a conversation with an NPC, I can see hundreds of little muscles moving underneath their skin. A few times it was almost indistinguishable from real life. Hats off to the animators over at CD Projekt Red. I hope this sets a new standard for realistic faces in games. One of my major issues is that you can't actually talk to any of the NPCs. There are thousands of them out here in Night City, dozens of individual kinds of NPCs, but the only ones you can have a conversation with are the ones that a quest directly sends you to. To me, the magical moments of Fallout and the Elder Scrolls are finding a new location, talking to an interesting looking local without a prompt, and finding yourself in the middle of a war between the Mechanist and the Ant Agonizer, or enslaved by the Daedric Prince Molag Bal. Cyberpunk has none of that. The NPCs exist to fill the empty space. There were over a dozen times I saw a really interesting looking shop or a character and tried to go interact with them, and, well, nothing. Even with that said, I need to qualify that, as a setting, Night City does not disappoint. Everything cyberpunk you could possibly ever want is here. Neon lighting, body modification, cyber implants, oppressive megacorps, disgusting streets, a thriving criminal underbelly, retro-futuristic cars that look like they're straight out of Disney's Tomorrowland, drugs, sex, and booze around every corner, it's all here. Night City feels like a place people live, so long as you don't spend too long in any one place. You can't pick up or interact with anything in the world. None of the NPCs will give you anything past the repeating, "Hey, fuck off!" You'll begin to notice that most of the NPCs don't have schedules. Shops are open 24/7, being run by the same clerk. The same guard stands watch at Arasaka properties every hour of every day. The day-night cycle seems to exist only to make the city prettier, and I do have to say that beholding the skyline of Night City in the dark is one of the most beautiful sights I've seen in a video game. In short, it feels like the most authentic and well-designed theme park ever engineered, and I think that's perfectly fine. I also have to mention that there have been times when 3 or 4 of the same NPC will be on the street walking past each other. While it isn't hurting my game experience, it is impossible to ignore, and it adds even more to my theme park analogy. Every piece of Night City feels just a little bit more like set dressing than it does authentic. It's not as immersive as the Fallout games or The Witcher 3, but the glory of being there in the middle of the illusion and soaking up everything around you, it feels good. It feels very cyberpunk. That being said, if you're one of the people that complain that Fallout 4 felt an ocean wide and a puddle deep, or you complained it wasn't a real RPG, you're going to be disappointed. Cyberpunk 2077 is very much the same game, but with better writing and much less of a sandbox to play in. V has a dingy apartment in a mega building that serves as the home base, but unfortunately none of it is customizable. The room exists mostly to hold your storage for weapons and gear you're not using and for your bed. I'll also note that sleeping doesn't give you any kind of bonus like in Bethesda RPGs, so there's no real reason to come back to your bed at night to sleep. I also personally haven't even come close to meeting half of my max capacity for carrying weight, so there hasn't really been a need for me to go back to my apartment ever. Cyberpunk 2077 is Westworld. If you play the game the way they want you to play it, you're gonna have a good time. If you try to find alternate ways of finishing quests besides the 1 or 2 that are afforded to you, or if you try to talk to people you're not supposed to talk to or go to shops you're not supposed to go to, the veil of immersion is going to start to crack pretty quickly. But if you let it happen, you can enjoy the most expansive and amazing looking and convincing facade of a real world that I've ever seen in a video game. There are 3 kinds of quests: a main quest, a side quest, and gigs. From a general quest perspective, Cyberpunk 2077 has some well-written and intriguing side quests. So far, they've not been as impressive to me as the side quests from The Witcher 3, but the side quests do totally avoid the go here, kill this, and come back thing. While creative, I've also found that many of the side quests have anticlimactic endings. I've often felt there are missing dialogue choices in these quests that would make it worth it or exciting, but I come up on a wall every single time. I found myself saying I should have been able to do X instead after every single side quest. There are sometimes 2 or even 3 ways to finish a quest, but again, none of them are ever the way I'd want to do it. I outright do not like the gig system in Cyberpunk 2077. In The Witcher 3, when you got to a new town, you would head to the message board and read about what's going on in the neighborhood. You'd venture to those places and complete quests and then be on your way. It felt organic and immersive. In Cyberpunk 2077, it's different. Every time you venture into a new neighborhood of Night City, a new fixer, a criminal middleman, will immediately call V and tell them about the contracts in the neighborhood. I have to assume V has somehow become a household name as the best of the best to every crime boss in the city, just off-screen when I wasn't playing. Regardless, you'll be called with a new quest maybe every 30 minutes by someone or another, and most of these contracts are the superficial kill enemies at this location quest. I quickly got tired of these gigs and have chosen not to do them for most of the game. The RPG aspects of Cyberpunk 2077 are not quite what CD Projekt Red promised. I have to again draw a line to Fallout 4. It is almost exactly the same top to bottom. You have 6 top-level stats, each of which has multiple levels and multiple perks within. You'll gain experience and raise your level, unlocking a stat point each time, and as you raise your reputation, your street cred score will rise. As you increase the base stats, you have accessed higher level perks. Guns, weapons, and armor are customizable and upgradable, and you get those parts by breaking down your old gear and crafting. It's always a tough choice in RPGs to decide whether to sell or dismantle an old weapon, but sticking with dismantling everything and crafting turned out to be the best way to proceed. You get plenty of money just by doing quests, and most guns don't sell for enough to be worth it. At the beginning, you'll choose between 3 life paths: Nomad, Street Kid, or Corpo. I chose Street Kid for my playthrough, trying to emulate Sombra, who you can see as my character. After a few hours, it becomes apparent that your chosen class actually does nothing. You'll occasionally be provided a few extra dialogue choices that have no consequence, and that's it. Your class has no effect on your stats, so don't worry too much about choosing the right one at the beginning. Unfortunately, the customizability does not extend to aesthetics. Now, this is a first-person game, so it doesn't realistically matter what your character looks like, but come on, we all love a fun game to dress up. I want my character to look the way she feels, and this leather jacket with spikes and sweatpants just isn't doing it for me. You'll have to settle for whatever gear you happen to find or buy, though, but the best static clothes won't typically be the ones you want to wear. The UI for Cyberpunk 2077 has vastly improved from The Witcher 3, CD Projekt Red's last RPG. The entire thing is built from the ground up for mouse and keyboard, which means that console players are likely not having a great time. Entering the menu, you can see at a glance what is where. It's intuitive in a way that RPGs with a ton of menus struggle with, but Cyberpunk keeps everything organized well. On top of that, it's completely possible to navigate the world without the cumbersome minimap. I turned it off immediately and I never looked back. Cyberpunk utilizes 3D markers in the world to take you to your destination, which I would say is much better than a compass, and definitely better than a minimap. I appreciate the sleek design of everything in the user interface, and that carries over to things like weapons and hacking overlays. It's easy to access healing items, throwables, and different buffs from the menus or during combat, and really it puts The Witcher 3 to shame in that respect. Anyone else remember having to equip food to unseeable button prompts to eat only outside of menus? Despite the caliber of the writing, Cyberpunk 2077 seems to be too afraid to say anything of substance about the police or the government's oppression. The huge corporations are often the bad guys, but V also receives wanted reports from the cops about which gang members are wanted, dead or alive. If you kill them, money is automatically wired to your account. This could have been a show-stopping commentary on the unchecked expansion of police power into militarization, but V remarks only that the system is convenient instead of being horrified that everyone in the world is a bounty hunter in training that could gun you down at any second if the police so choose. V is constantly committing crimes that would mark her as a primary target for the police, and yet she feels comfortable gunning down other similar criminals who have likely committed far less egregious sins, on behalf of the police. Combat feels better than expected, but gunplay isn't quite as smooth as some top contenders like Far Cry 5 or Destiny 2. You can add 3 weapons to your loadout and switch them out at any time. It's easy to switch between guns during combat, and it feels fluid to change between melee and ranged weapons on a dime. Melee weapons don't feel quite as good as the guns, and if you're on mouse and keyboard, the dodge mechanics are usually unusable for close combat. The default recoil of SMGs is uncontrollable, but Leveling up your character's reflexes perks will smooth that out. Nothing really to complain or boast about here, the combat is good enough. Vehicle control is also fine, although the mouse and keyboard provides you no control over the speed at which you are driving. In addition, while most keys can be rebound, interact is set to the F key with no way to change it. Any PC gamer out there knows that the industry standard for 2 decades has been E to interact, and the fact that it can't be rebound is a truly baffling decision. Luckily, there exists a mod to fix both the car controls and the interact button, which I will link in the description. I cycled between using mouse and keyboard and a controller during my playthrough to get a feel for both, but ended up sticking with mouse and keyboard. I highly recommend downloading this mod and using mouse and keyboard. Navigating the menus with a controller is an absolute mess. Cyberpunk 2077 is badly optimized. I discovered while playing that it was only utilizing 13% of my video RAM from my 2060 Super and using 60% of my CPU. A Reddit user found a fix by altering a CSV file in the engine, and that will be linked in the description as well. Once I unlocked the VRAM cap, my FPS skyrocketed. Originally, I was on medium settings in 1440p, struggling to keep 60 FPS. After this fix, I was suddenly getting a solid 75 on high settings. I have no idea why CD Projekt Red coded the game this way, but they are gimping their own graphics. My final point is one which I can no longer avoid. Cyberpunk 2077 contains perhaps the most dysfunctional AI I can ever remember seeing in a AAA game. Enemies will constantly stop fighting and put their guns down while combat persists. Cops don't notice if you accidentally murder someone in front of them. NPCs you interact with during quests don't recognize you after the quests are done. The cars are constantly starting and stopping for no reason. Citizens will cower before me with no prompting or even run screaming. Some hostile NPCs will yell at me as if attacking and then do nothing. I was once in a firefight with several cops and gang members, and after the battle ended, I stood above the carnage and a police officer walked by without making a remark. Again, I'm coming back to the NPCs feeling like robots in a theme park that weren't programmed quite right. Several times people will just get up and walk away from me during dialogue, and the conversation just ends, forcing me to reload a save. Even on the PC version, the bugs are most apparent in the AI behavior. This is completely unacceptable. Aside from AI issues, there were a lot of minor bugs, probably not worth mentioning. Nothing worse than what you would have seen in The Witcher 3 on PC. Cyberpunk 2077 was ambitious beyond its capabilities, and that shows. While it has a lot of flaws and is unequivocally problematic and exploitative in how it handles racial stereotypes, the glitz and glamour of Night City feels real if you don't examine it too hard. Cyberpunk 2077 claims to be satire, but it never makes it clear what it's actually satirizing. What we're left with thematically is that crime is okay when V does it, but it's bad when other people do it. Just don't think about it too much. Not every game needs to be a cerebral experience. Sometimes it's okay to just live in the world, take it in, and feel it. Immerse yourself. Walking into a club with the music pounding and a cyborg bartender pouring drinks for neon-clad gangsters, it's exhilarating. It feels cool. I feel for a moment that I'm in Akira or Ghost in the Shell or Blade Runner. The dialogue is cleverly written, if not cleverly organized, but the ability to complete quests my way just isn't a priority for the game. The lack of organic quest discovery soured my experience greatly, and the light RPG mechanics were a little disappointing after CD Projekt Red promised even more depth than The Witcher 3. Of course, the AI is almost indescribably dysfunctional, even in the working version of the game, but behind all of that is the most elaborate and possibly most beautiful world in video game history. I recommend Cyberpunk 2077 for fans of Fallout 4 or GTA 5, or for folks who just want to play around in a cyberpunk world and maybe pretend to be a Blade Runner for a few hours. I don't recommend it for anyone looking for a deep RPG experience, or for a game that allows you to play your way, or for anything with complex dialogue trees. Play this game the way that CDPR wants you to play it, and you'll have a good time. If you agree with or disagree with anything I've said here, or have any questions, feel free to throw it in the comments. Thank you for joining me for this review of Cyberpunk 2077. Like I said, you can find our review of the console version on our website at Gameluster.com, and please be sure to subscribe to us here and follow us on Twitter for everything else gaming.